As the evening wound down, and they settled into their storm-altered routines, David found himself wondering if some wants were worth fighting for. If some families were worth the risk of believing they could survive the complications. As he tucked Isabella into bed, she looked up at him with Elena's eyes and said, "Daddy, I think the rain spirits brought us exactly what we needed." And for the first time in 3 years, David thought she might be right. Ready for the complete story? Smash that subscribe button and tell me where you are tuning in from in the comments. Tomorrow brings another mind-blowing story that's just as unbelievable. Trust me, you will want to be here for it. Alright, let's jump into it. The mahogany desk gleamed under the afternoon light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office. David Lansbury's fingers drummed against the polished surface as he reviewed quarterly reports that would make most people dizzy with their zeros. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth $12 billion, but the numbers on his screen felt as cold as the marble floors echoing throughout his Malibu mansion. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Lansbury, Isabella's therapist called. She's had another episode at school." David's jaw tightened. His 6-year-old daughter, brilliant, beautiful, and lost in a world that seemed determined to misunderstand her autism, had been through 4 nannies in 6 months. Each had lasted until Isabella's needs proved more complex than their patience allowed. "Send the car," he said, already reaching for his jacket, "and contact the agency. We need someone new by tomorrow." Someone new. Always someone new. 40 minutes later, David stood in the marble foyer of his home, watching Isabella rock silently in the corner, her dark hair covering her face like a curtain. The latest nanny, was her name Rebecca? Rachel? Stood nearby with her resignation letter already typed, her discomfort obvious in every rigid line of her posture. "She just shut down during art class," the woman explained, avoiding his gaze. "I tried everything the therapist suggested, but she wouldn't respond." The other parents were staring. David felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. The weight of failing his daughter, of being unable to reach her the way his wife Elena had. Elena, who had died when Isabella was 3, taking with her the only voice that had ever seemed to truly calm their daughter's storms. "I understand," he said curtly, though understanding felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. "Your final check will be deposited tomorrow." As the nanny gathered her things and left, David knelt beside his daughter, careful not to touch her. She'd been sensitive to contact since Elena's death. "Bella? Daddy's here." Isabella's rocking intensified. The silence stretched between them like an ocean he couldn't cross. Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped apartment that smelled of coffee and hope, Shania Brown folded her nursing school acceptance letter for the 100th time. Her fingers traced the embossed seal as her 8-year-old son Jamal practiced piano on the second-hand keyboard she'd bought with 3 months of tips from her diner job. "You're gonna wear out that paper, Mama," Jamal said without looking up from the keys, his small fingers finding melody in the discount instrument. Shania smiled, tucking the letter back into her purse. 26 years old, and she was finally going to be more than just another face in an apron. But nursing school cost money. Money she didn't have after her ex-husband had drained their savings and disappeared into the night 2 years ago. Her phone buzzed. The employment agency. "Shania? I've got something. High-end family, live-in position. The pay is, well, it's substantial. But they've been through multiple caregivers. The child has special needs." Shania looked around her small apartment. The water stain on the ceiling, the threadbare carpet, Jamal's outgrown clothes piled on the chair. Special needs didn't scare her. Love didn't scare her. Being invisible did. What kind of special needs? Autism. 6-year-old girl. The family is prominent. Wealthy. They'll need someone who can handle both childcare and light housekeeping. Someone who won't be intimidated by their lifestyle. Shania thought of her own childhood, raised by a grandmother who cleaned houses in Beverly Hills, taught to be grateful for scraps from tables she'd never be invited to join. But this wasn't about pride. This was about Jamal's future. Her future. When do I start? That evening, David stood in Isabella's bedroom doorway, watching her line up her stuffed animals with mathematical precision. Each toy had its place, its purpose, its order. Unlike his own life, which had felt chaotic since Elena's car accident had shattered their small, perfect world. The house felt too big around them. 23 rooms, and most days the only sounds were Isabella's soft humming and the echo of his own footsteps against marble floors. He'd bought the mansion for Elena, who had dreamed of filling it with laughter and dinner parties and the warmth of a large family. Now it felt like a museum dedicated to what they'd lost. His phone rang. The agency again. "Mr. Lansbury, we've found someone. Shania Brown. She has experience with special needs children, excellent references, and she's available to start immediately. She's bringing her son. I hope that's acceptable." David hesitated. Another person in the house meant another person who would eventually leave when Isabella's needs proved too challenging. Another person who would look at his daughter and see a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. But what choice did he have? Fine. Have her here tomorrow at 8. After hanging up, he approached Isabella's bed slowly. She looked up at him with Elena's dark eyes. So intelligent, so distant. "We're getting a new friend tomorrow, Bella. Her name is Shania." Isabella returned to arranging her animals, but David could have sworn he saw her pause at the name. As he turned off her light, leaving only the star projector Elena had installed to calm Isabella's nighttime anxiety, David wondered if this Shania Brown would be different. If she would see what he was failing to see in his own daughter. Or if she would just be another person counting down the days until she could escape the complexity of loving someone who couldn't always love you back in ways the world understood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble entryway as David adjusted his tie, preparing for another day of board meetings and acquisition deals. The house felt different with anticipation hanging in the air. Or maybe that was just his imagination. Isabella sat at the breakfast table, methodically eating her cereal one piece at a time, counting under her breath. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. David opened the door to find a woman with warm brown eyes and natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. Beside her stood a boy with curious eyes and a shy smile, clutching a worn backpack. "Mr. Lansbury? I'm Shania Brown. This is my son, Jamal." Her voice was softer than he'd expected, with a slight southern lilt that reminded him of summer evenings and front porch conversations, things he'd never experienced but somehow recognized as comfort. "Please come in." David stepped aside, watching as Shania's eyes took in the opulent surroundings without the usual mixture of awe and intimidation he was accustomed to seeing. Instead, she seemed to be looking for something else entirely. "Where's Isabella?" she asked simply. David led them to the kitchen, where his daughter still sat at the table, now arranging her remaining cereal into perfect rows. At the sound of footsteps, Isabella's movements became more rigid, her shoulders hunching slightly. "Bella," David said carefully, "this is Shania. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Isabella didn't look up, but her counting grew audible. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Shania approached slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. Instead of trying to interrupt or redirect Isabella's behavior, she simply sat in the chair across from her and waited. Jamal, reading his mother's cues, settled quietly in the corner with a book. The silence stretched for several minutes. David found himself checking his watch, preparing to explain Isabella's patterns, to apologize for her lack of response. But Shania seemed content to wait, occasionally glancing at the serial arrangement with what looked like genuine interest. "That's a beautiful pattern," Shania said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "Very organized. I like how you've made groups of 5. Isabella's counting paused. Her dark eyes flicked up for just a moment, meeting Shania's gaze before darting away. "My grandmama used to line up her buttons the same way when she sewed," Shania continued, her tone conversational but not demanding. "She said it helped her think better. Does it help you think better too?" For the first time in months, Isabella's rigid posture softened slightly. She didn't respond verbally, but David noticed her breathing had changed, becoming less shallow. "I bet you see patterns everywhere," Shania said, leaning back in her chair to give Isabella space. "In the tiles on the floor, in the leaves outside. Sometimes the world makes more sense when we can see how things fit together." Isabella's hands stilled completely. She looked up again, this time holding Shania's gaze for several seconds before returning to her cereal. But something had shifted in the room. A tension David hadn't even realized was there had begun to dissolve. "Would you like to show me your room?" Shania asked gently. "I'd love to see what other patterns you've discovered." David expected Isabella to refuse, to retreat into herself as she did with every new caregiver. Instead, his daughter stood up slowly, leaving her cereal arranged in perfect rows, and walked toward the stairs. She paused at the doorway and looked back at Shania with something that might have been an invitation. As they disappeared upstairs, David found himself following at a distance, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. From the hallway, he could hear their voices, Shania's warm and encouraging, Isabella's soft responses barely audible, but definitely present. "Oh my!" Shania's voice carried wonder, not surprise. "Look at this beautiful collection." David peered around the doorframe to see Isabella's room, as if for the first time. Every surface was arranged with mathematical precision. Books organized by color and height, stuffed animals lined up by size, art supplies sorted into rainbow order. What he had seen as compulsion, Shania was viewing as artistry. "This is amazing, Isabella. You've created something really special here." Shania knelt beside Isabella's desk, where colored pencils were arranged in perfect gradient order. "May I?" Isabella nodded, and Shania gently picked up a blue pencil, examining it with the same reverence someone might show a precious artifact. "I can see why this one goes here," Shania murmured. "It's the perfect bridge between the darker blue and the lighter one. You have such a good eye for color." David watched his daughter's face transform. The walls she'd built around herself since Elena's death seemed to crack just slightly, letting in the first light he'd seen in her eyes in months. "Do you want to see my favorite color?" Isabella whispered, her voice so soft David had to strain to hear it. "I would love that." Isabella walked to her closet and pulled out a small wooden box David had never seen before. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a single purple crayon, worn down to a nub from use. "Purple," Isabella said, the word carrying weight beyond its simplicity. "Purple," Shania repeated with reverence. "That's a very special color, strong and gentle at the same time." David felt his chest tighten as he watched this stranger see his daughter, truly see her, in a way that he'd been failing to do for 3 years. The clinical detachment he'd maintained, the emotional distance he'd convinced himself was protection, suddenly felt like betrayal. From his position in the hallway, David Lansbury felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. And for the first time since Elena's death, he wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild them. David retreated to his office, but the image of Isabella's transformed face haunted him like a ghost. He sat behind his desk, trying to focus on the merger documents spread before him, but the numbers blurred together. Through his window, he could see Shania and both children in the garden. Isabella actually pointing at something, Jamal listening intently, all three of them bathed in golden afternoon light. He forced himself to look away. This was temporary. It had to be. In 3 weeks, maybe 4, Shania would realize what the others had. That Isabella's needs were too complex, too demanding. That loving a child who couldn't love you back in conventional ways was exhausting. That the weight of Elena's absence pressed against every corner of this house like a living thing. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother Michael. "How's the new nanny working out?" "Mom's asking." David stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could he explain that in one morning, a stranger had accomplished what he'd been failing to do for 3 years? That watching someone else connect with his daughter made him feel simultaneously grateful and utterly inadequate. "Too early to tell," he typed back. "You know how these things go." But even as he sent it, David knew this felt different. And that terrified him more than Isabella's silence ever had. Downstairs, Shania helped Isabella arrange fallen leaves by color gradients, while Jamal practiced his piano scales on the baby grand David had bought but never used. The domestic scene should have felt natural, but Shania's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. She'd seen that look in David Lansbury's eyes when he watched them together, a mixture of wonder and retreat that she recognized from her childhood. The same expression her grandmother's employers wore when they realized the help was becoming too comfortable, too real, too human. "Don't get attached," she reminded herself, the same mantra that had gotten her through 2 years of serving tables and scraping by. This is a job, a means to an end. But watching Isabella's careful fingers sort through maple leaves, seeing the intelligence and gentleness this child kept hidden from a world that didn't know how to receive it, Shania felt her professional distance crumbling like sand. "Mama," Jamal appeared at her elbow, his voice low. "The man's watching us again." Shania glanced up to see David's silhouette in his office window before he quickly stepped away. Her stomach tightened. In her experience, when wealthy men started paying too much attention, it never ended well for women like her. "Just keep playing, baby," she murmured to Jamal. "We're fine." But were they? Isabella had begun responding to her with an openness that felt precious and fragile. The child was starved for understanding, for someone who saw her patterns as art rather than symptoms. Shania recognized the hunger because she'd lived with it herself. The desperate need to be seen as more than the sum of your struggles. 1 year, she told herself. Save enough for nursing school and get out before anyone gets hurt. But as Isabella placed a perfect orange leaf in her hand and whispered, "This one's like sunshine," Shania wondered if she was already too late. That evening, David stood in his walk-in closet, loosening his tie and trying to convince himself that the laughter echoing from downstairs meant nothing. Shania was reading to both children before bed, something about dragons and brave princesses that had Isabella giggling. Actually giggling. When had he last heard his daughter laugh? He descended the stairs quietly, drawn by the sound like a moth to flame. From the living room doorway, he watched Shania bring the storybook to life with different voices for each character, watched Isabella's eyes shine with delight, watched Jamal lean against Shania's shoulder with the unconscious comfort of a child who felt completely safe. The scene was so perfect it physically hurt. "Daddy!" Isabella noticed him first, her excitement cutting through the cozy atmosphere like a blade. "Shania's reading about Princess Luna. She has purple hair like my favorite crayon." David's throat constricted. Isabella had barely spoken to him in months, and now she was sharing her inner world with enthusiastic joy. Because of Shania. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. Shania looked up at him, and something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, maybe embarrassment. She closed the book gently. "I should get these two ready for bed," she said, her warmth noticeably cooler than it had been all day. "Come on, Jamal. Isabella, would you like to show Jamal your bathroom routine?" As they headed upstairs, David heard Isabella explaining her precise toothbrushing pattern to Jamal with scientific detail. Normal. She sounded so brilliantly, perfectly normal. He poured himself a scotch and stood by the window, watching his reflection in the darkened glass. Elena stared back at him in his own features. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline. She would have loved Shania, would have seen immediately what David was trying so hard to resist acknowledging. But Elena was gone, and David had learned that loving people, trusting them, meant giving them the power to destroy you when they inevitably left. His phone rang. The agency. "Mr. Lansbury? Just checking in. How is Ms. Brown working out?" David's grip tightened on the glass. "Fine. She's adequate. Wonderful. Her references were impeccable, and she seems genuinely committed to special needs care. We're confident this will be a long-term placement." Long-term. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they sent panic racing through his chest. After hanging up, David finished his drink and climbed the stairs. Isabella's door was cracked open, and he could hear Shania's voice, soft and melodic, singing what sounded like a lullaby. He'd never heard the song before, but somehow it sounded like home. He closed his office door and buried himself in work until the house fell silent. Later, lying in his empty bed, David stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself that the ache in his chest was indigestion, not longing. That the way Shania had looked at Isabella, with such pure, uncomplicated love, didn't make him wonder what it would feel like to be seen that way himself. He was Isabella's father. Shania was an employee. These were facts, boundaries, safety. But as sleep finally claimed him, David dreamed of purple crayons and gentle laughter, of a woman's voice singing songs he'd never learned but somehow remembered. And he woke knowing that everything he'd built to protect himself was already crumbling. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Shania had settled into the rhythm of the Lansbury household. What began as light morning drizzle had transformed into a full-blown Pacific storm by noon, with winds that bent the palm trees nearly horizontal and rain that turned the mansion's expansive windows into rivers of water. David stood in his office, watching his outdoor furniture scatter across the lawn like toys, when his assistant called. "The airports are shut down, Mr. Lansbury. Your flight to New York has been cancelled, along with everything else. They're saying the storm won't pass until tomorrow night at earliest." David's jaw tightened. The merger meeting he'd been preparing for couldn't be postponed. Too many moving pieces, too much money at stake. But as another gust of wind rattled his windows, he realized he wasn't going anywhere. Downstairs, the power flickered twice before dying completely, plunging the house into the grey half-light of the storm. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie amber glow. "Mr. Lansbury?" Shania's voice called from the main floor, steady despite the circumstances. "The children are asking about the lights." David found them in the living room. Isabella pressed against Shania's side, not with fear, but with the heightened sensitivity she showed during any disruption to routine. Jamal sat nearby, his young face trying to mask worry he was too mature to feel. "The generator should kick in soon," David said, though privately he wondered if it would handle a storm of this magnitude. "We just need to." A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by the sound of something heavy hitting the roof. Isabella's hands flew to her ears, and she began the rocking motion that usually preceded a complete shutdown. Without hesitation, Shania began humming, not a lullaby this time, but something rhythmic and steady that seemed to anchor Isabella to the present moment. Her hands moved in gentle patterns against Isabella's back, creating a cocoon of calm in the chaos. The generator's not starting, David realized aloud, checking his phone. The backup system might be damaged. How long until? Shania began, but another crash cut her off. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see a massive tree branch blocking the circular driveway. "We're not going anywhere tonight," David admitted, the words carrying more weight than simple logistics. Isabella's rocking intensified. "Different," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "Everything's different." David felt the familiar helplessness wash over him. Isabella's need for routine wasn't a preference, it was survival. Changes in environment could trigger episodes that lasted for days, leaving both of them exhausted and disconnected. But Shania was already moving, her mind clearly working through solutions. "Isabella," she said gently, "remember when we talked about patterns? How sometimes we have to make new ones when the old ones get interrupted." Isabella's rocking slowed slightly. "What if we made a storm pattern? Something that belongs just to tonight, just to us." David watched, fascinated despite his stress, as Shania gathered candles from around the room. She arranged them in a circle on the coffee table, creating a warm pool of light that pushed back the amber emergency glow. "Jamal, can you help me find some blankets? We're going to build something special." Within minutes, they had constructed an impromptu fort using couch cushions and throws, with the candle circle at its center. The space felt intimate and safe, separated from the storm's chaos by intention rather than walls. "Now," Shania said, settling into the fort with both children, "this is our storm sanctuary. The rules are different here because this is different time." Isabella's breathing had steadied. "Different time." "Exactly. Storm time, where we tell stories and share secrets and maybe learn things about each other we didn't know before." David found himself drawn into their circle, though he remained on its edges. The corporate titan who commanded boardrooms felt suddenly uncertain in this space where his usual authority meant nothing. "I don't know any stories," he said awkwardly. Shania's eyes found his across the candlelight, and he saw understanding there, not judgment, but recognition of his vulnerability. "Everyone knows stories," she said gently. "Sometimes they're just hidden under other things." The house creaked around them as the storm intensified, but within their small sanctuary, something magical was happening. Isabella began talking, really talking, about the colors she saw when she listened to music, about the stories her stuffed animals told each other when no one was watching. Jamal shared his dream of becoming a composer, his small hands moving through the air as he described symphonies only he could hear. And gradually, inevitably, the conversation turned to David. "What did you want to be when you were my age?" Isabella asked, her question cutting through his defenses with childlike directness. David's throat tightened. When had anyone last asked him about dreams rather than quarterly projections? "I wanted to be an astronaut," he heard himself saying, the admission feeling rusty from disuse. "I thought if I could get far enough away from Earth, I could see how everything fit together." Shania's eyes widened slightly, the first crack he'd seen in her professional composure. "Did you ever try?" "Life got in the way," David said, then immediately regretted the bitterness in his voice. "Responsibilities. Reality. But you still look up sometimes," Isabella said with startling insight. "I see you watching the stars from your office window." The simple observation hit him like a physical blow. His 6-year-old daughter had noticed something about him that he'd forgotten about himself. As the storm raged outside, they shared stories and comfortable silences, the boundaries between employer and employee, parent and child, gradually dissolving in the candlelight. David found himself studying Shania's profile as she listened to Jamal's animated description of his favorite piano piece, noting the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the graceful movement of her hands as she gestured. She was beautiful, not just physically, though the candlelight caught the gold undertones in her brown skin and made her eyes luminous. She was beautiful in the way she made space for others to be themselves, in the natural warmth that drew people into her orbit. And that terrified him more than any corporate takeover ever had. "We should try to get some sleep," Shania said eventually, though none of them seemed eager to break the spell of their storm sanctuary. As they settled into their makeshift beds, David insisting that Shania and the children take the couches while he claimed a chair, he realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's obligations or yesterday's losses. He was simply present, in this moment, with these people who were becoming something more than circumstances had intended. The storm continued to rage outside, but David fell asleep to the sound of gentle breathing and the lingering warmth of shared stories, wondering if some barriers were meant to be washed away. Morning arrived grey and subdued, the storm having exhausted itself against the California coast. David woke to find Isabella curled up on the floor beside his chair, her small body seeking the comfort of proximity she rarely allowed herself. Across the room, Shania and Jamal were still asleep on the couch, her arm protectively wrapped around her son. The power had returned sometime during the night, but none of them had stirred to turn off the candles or dismantle their fort. In the pale dawn light filtering through rain-streaked windows, their sanctuary looked fragile and precious, like something that might disappear if examined too closely. David's phone buzzed with missed messages, but for once, the demands of his empire felt distant. He watched Shania wake slowly, her defenses down in those first vulnerable moments before awareness returned. When her eyes found his, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with witnessed vulnerability. "Coffee," he offered quietly, not wanting to wake the children. "Please." In the kitchen, they moved around each other with surprising ease, David preparing the coffee while Shania assessed the storm damage through the windows. The massive tree branch still blocked the driveway, and scattered debris covered the grounds. "Looks like we're stuck for a while longer," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Would that be problematic for you?" Shania's pause was barely perceptible. "I don't have anywhere else to be." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd intended. David poured coffee into 2 mugs, noting how her hands trembled slightly when she accepted hers. "Last night," he began, then stopped. How could he explain that their storm sanctuary had felt more like home than this house had in 3 years? That watching her create safety for his daughter had awakened something in him he'd thought died with Elena? Was unusual, Shania finished diplomatically, though her eyes held warmth. Isabella did well with the routine disruption. "She trusts you." The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Shania set down her coffee, her composure finally cracking. "Trust is dangerous in my world, Mr. Lansbury. People like me, we learn early that trust gets weaponized." David studied her profile, seeing shadows he'd been too self-absorbed to notice before. "What happened?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she seemed to make a decision, her shoulders straightening with resolve. "I was 17. Just graduated high school, working as a housekeeper for a family in Atlanta. The Montgomerys." Her voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. Mrs. Montgomery was kind to me, treated me like family. I thought she saw me as more than just help. She paused, staring into her coffee as if the memories were written in its surface. Their son came home from college for Christmas. He was charming. Told me I was special, different from other girls he knew. I believed him because I wanted to so badly. David's chest tightened, anticipating the trajectory of her story. When I got pregnant, the family that had loved me like their own suddenly remembered exactly what I was to them. Mrs. Montgomery offered me money for an abortion. When I refused, she accused me of trying to trap her son into marriage. Said I was delusional if I thought someone like him would ever choose someone like me. The kitchen fell silent except for the drip of water from the storm gutters outside. David felt rage building in his chest, not at Shania, but for her. The son denied everything, said I was a troubled girl with fantasies. His parents believed him, of course, or chose to. Shania's laugh was bitter. I was fired, blacklisted from other positions in the area. Had to move back with my grandmother, work double shifts at a diner to support Jamal. She looked up at David then, her eyes fierce with protective pride. But I never regretted keeping him. Not for 1 second. David set down his coffee, moved by an impulse he couldn't name. Shania, I'm not telling you this for sympathy, she said quickly. I'm telling you so you understand why I keep boundaries. Why I can't afford to mistake kindness for something more. The words hit him like a physical blow. In her story, he heard his own fears reflected. The terror of being seen as nothing more than your usefulness to others. But where his wealth had been armor, her circumstances had left her exposed to predators who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. I would never, he began. You're a good man, Mr. Lansbury. But you're also a billionaire, and I clean your house. Those kinds of power imbalances, they don't end well for people like me. Before David could respond, small footsteps announced Isabella's arrival. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair mussed from sleep, clutching her favorite purple crayon. Shania, are you sad? Shania's transformation was instant. Walls rebuilding, professional warmth returning. No, sweetheart. Just tired. Did you sleep well? But Isabella's perceptiveness couldn't be deflected so easily. She walked to Shania and carefully placed the purple crayon in her hand. Purple is for brave feelings, Isabella said solemnly. Mama told me that before she went to heaven. She said purple holds both sad and strong at the same time. The room went absolutely still. David's breath caught. Isabella had never spoken about Elena's death so directly, never shared the private conversations they'd had about colors and feelings. Shania knelt to Isabella's level, the purple crayon cradled reverently in her palm. Your mama sounds very wise. She was like you, Isabella continued, her voice matter-of-fact. She saw patterns other people missed, and she never left even when things got different. David's throat constricted as he watched his daughter's simple acceptance bridge the gap between past and present. Elena would have loved Shania, not despite their differences, but because of the courage and grace she brought to loving difficult things. Thank you for sharing this with me, Shania whispered, her professional composure finally crumbling completely. It's the most beautiful gift anyone's ever given me. As Isabella padded back to wake Jamal, David and Shania remained in the kitchen, the purple crayon between them like a covenant. Something fundamental had shifted in the space of their shared stories. Recognition, perhaps, that they were both more wounded and more whole than they'd allowed themselves to believe. The storm had passed, but David realized that some kinds of weather were meant to strip away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only what was real enough to rebuild upon. The cleanup from the storm became an unexpected adventure. With the driveway still blocked and phone service spotty, the outside world felt temporarily suspended, creating a bubble of normalcy David hadn't experienced since before Elena's death. He found himself working alongside Shania to clear smaller debris from the gardens, their earlier conversation having created a strange intimacy. She moved with purposeful grace, gathering broken branches while keeping one eye on the children, who were turning puddle jumping into an elaborate game with mathematical rules that only Isabella understood. 17 jumps in the big puddle, then 3 in the small ones, Isabella explained to Jamal with scientific precision. It has to be exactly that pattern, or the rain spirits get confused. Rain spirits? David asked, pausing in his work. Shania smiled, the first genuinely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since her revelation in the kitchen. That's my grandmother's influence. She taught me that everything in nature has personality if you know how to listen. Nana Brown says the rain spirits help flowers remember how to grow, Jamal added, executing a perfect jump sequence under Isabella's watchful eye. David watched his daughter's face light up with delight as Jamal followed her pattern exactly. She's never played with another child like this, he said quietly to Shania. The other kids at school, they don't understand her games. Because they're trying to change her instead of learning her language, Shania replied, her voice holding gentle conviction. Isabella doesn't need fixing. She needs translating. The simple statement hit David with unexpected force. How many specialists had he consulted? How many therapies had he arranged? All focused on making Isabella more normal. When had he stopped seeing her differences as gifts and started seeing them as problems to solve? Look, Daddy, Isabella called out, her voice bright with excitement. Jamal speaks pattern. Something loosened in David's chest as he watched his daughter experience the joy of being understood. When had he last heard her laugh with such abandon? When had he last seen her body relaxed instead of rigid with the effort of navigating a world that felt foreign? Your turn, Mr. Lansbury, Jamal called out, waving him toward the puddles. I don't think, David began, but Isabella was already running to him, her small hand slipping into his with surprising trust. You have to learn the pattern, Daddy. Shania says patterns are like music, and you just have to feel the rhythm. David found himself being led to the largest puddle, acutely aware of his expensive shoes and tailored pants. But Isabella's expectant face made his concerns seem trivial. 17 jumps, she instructed solemnly. Ready. The first jump felt ridiculous. The second, slightly less so. By the 10th, David realized he was actually enjoying the satisfying splash of water, the way Isabella counted along with breathless anticipation. When he completed the sequence exactly as prescribed, her cheer of triumph made him feel more accomplished than any corporate merger ever had. Now you speak pattern too, she declared, throwing her arms around his waist in a spontaneous hug that took his breath away. When had she last hugged him like that? When had he last felt worthy of such uncomplicated affection? I think the rain spirits approve, Shania said softly, and when David looked up, her eyes held something that looked dangerously like fondness. Later, as afternoon faded into evening, they found themselves in the kitchen preparing dinner together. The power had returned, but somehow the domestic scene felt more connected to their candlelit sanctuary than to the usual sterile efficiency of David's ordered life. Shania taught Isabella how to season vegetables with what she called grandmother measurements. A pinch of this, a dash of that, guided by intuition rather than recipes. David watched his daughter's face scrunch in concentration as she tasted and adjusted, her usual need for precision adapting to this new kind of pattern. My grandmother always said cooking was like loving, Shania explained, guiding Isabella's small hand as she stirred. You put in what feels right, and trust that it will nourish the people you care about. Is that why it tastes different when you cook? Isabella asked with startling perception. Shania's hand stilled for a moment. What do you mean, sweetheart? It tastes like caring. The other ladies who worked here, their food just tasted like food. David felt something twist in his chest as he realized how much his daughter had been observing, how carefully she'd been categorizing the emotions that flavored their household. How had he missed that she was starving for genuine affection, not just professional competence? That's because caring is the most important ingredient, Shania said gently, and you can always taste when it's missing. As they sat down to eat, around the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room, by Isabella's request, David found himself studying the scene with wonder. Jamal was telling Isabella about his favorite piano pieces, his hands moving in animated gestures that made her giggle. Shania listened with the focused attention she gave everything, asking questions that drew out more details, more joy. This felt like family in a way that their previous arrangements never had. Not the careful choreography of hired help managing his daughter's needs, but the organic messiness of people choosing to care for each other. Shania, Isabella said suddenly, her voice carrying the weight of serious consideration. Are you going to leave like the others? The question fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension. David saw Shania's face tighten almost imperceptibly, saw her glance at him with something that might have been appeal. What makes you ask that, baby? Because you're different, Isabella said with her characteristic directness. The others were always watching the clock, counting days. But you're watching us. Like you want to remember. David's throat constricted. His daughter's perceptiveness was both gift and curse. She saw truths that adults spent years learning to hide from themselves. Shania reached across the table and took Isabella's hand. I'm not planning to go anywhere, Isabella. But sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices about what's best. But what if what's best is staying? Isabella pressed, her voice carrying a vulnerability that made David's chest ache. What if what's best is being a family? The word hung in the air between them. Family, with all its implications and impossibilities. David saw Shania's composure crack, saw her struggle between professional distance and the genuine love that had been growing in the spaces between her defenses. Sometimes what we want and what we can have are different things, Shania said quietly, and David knew she was speaking to him as much as to Isabella. But as the evening wound down and they settled into their storm-altered routines, David found himself wondering if some wants were worth fighting for. If some families were worth the risk of believing they could survive the complications. As he tucked Isabella into bed, she looked up at him with Elena's eyes and said, Daddy, I think the rain spirits brought us exactly what we needed. And for the first time in 3 years, David thought she might be right. The photograph arrived on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the storm had washed away their careful boundaries. David found it slipped under his office door. No envelope, no explanation, just a glossy image that made his blood run cold. It showed Shania and him in the garden, heads bent close together as they worked. To an outside observer, the scene might have looked innocent enough. But the photographer had captured a moment of laughter, David's hand reaching to brush dirt from Shania's cheek, her eyes soft with something that looked dangerously like love. On the back, someone had written in precise script, "Interesting domestic arrangements. Would make for compelling headlines, don't you think?" David's hands shook as he turned the photo over again, studying the timestamp. 3 days ago, someone had been watching them, documenting their growing closeness with predatory patience. His phone rang immediately, as if the caller had been waiting for him to discover their message. David Lansbury. His voice came out harder than intended. "Mr. Lansbury, Richard Blackwood, Financial Tribune. I believe you received our little gift. David's jaw clenched. Blackwood, a bottom feeder who specialized in scandal masquerading as financial journalism. What do you want? Just a comment on your romantic involvement with your domestic staff. Our readers find these kinds of stories compelling. Billionaire finds love with the help, that sort of thing. Very heartwarming. There's no story here. Oh, but there is. Blackwood's voice carried oily satisfaction. We have several photos, actually. You three playing happy family. The children getting along beautifully. Very touching. Of course, some might question the power dynamics involved. The ethics of a wealthy man pursuing his employee. Especially given Ms. Brown's vulnerable circumstances. David's vision blurred with rage. You stay away from her. That's not really up to me, is it? The story runs tomorrow, unless you'd like to discuss alternative arrangements. My rates are quite reasonable. David ended the call and slumped in his chair, the photograph burning in his hands like evidence of a crime. Everything he'd been trying to deny came crashing down around him. He was in love with Shania. Completely, irrevocably, dangerously in love. And now that love had become a weapon that could destroy everything she'd worked for. He could see the headlines already. Billionaire's inappropriate relationship with Maid. The story would follow Shania for years, making her unemployable in any respectable household. Jamal would face questions at school. Her dreams of nursing school would crumble under the weight of scandal. All because David Lansbury couldn't keep his heart in check. Shania was in Isabella's room, helping her organize a collection of pressed flowers from their garden adventures, when David appeared in the doorway. The moment she saw his face, her stomach dropped. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority she hadn't heard since her first day. "My office." "Now." Isabella looked up from her flowers, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Daddy, is something wrong?" "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," David said, but his forced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Stay here with Jamal." In his office, David closed the door with deliberate care before turning to face her. The man who had jumped in puddles with his daughter, who had listened to her stories with genuine interest, had vanished. In his place stood the billionaire she'd first met, distant, controlled, untouchable. "This was a mistake," he said without preamble, placing the photograph on his desk between them like a barrier. Shania's breath caught as she saw herself captured in a moment of unguarded happiness, saw how her feelings for David showed plainly in her expression. The intimacy between them was undeniable, written in body language and shared laughter. Where did this come from? A journalist. He wants money to keep it quiet, but that's not the point. David's voice was flat, professional. The point is that we've compromised your position here, and Isabella's stability. Shania felt the familiar walls slamming back into place around her heart. "I see. Do you?" David stepped closer, and she could see the pain he was trying to hide beneath his corporate mask. "Do you see that loving me could destroy your reputation? Your future? Your son's security?" The word loving hung in the air between them like a confession neither of them was prepared to handle. "That's not your decision to make," Shania said quietly, but her voice shook with the effort of staying calm. "Isn't it? I'm your employer. The power differential alone makes this inappropriate. What happened to keeping boundaries?" His words were meant to wound, and they found their mark perfectly. Shania straightened her shoulders, calling on every lesson her grandmother had taught her about surviving in spaces where she wasn't wanted. "You're right," she said, her voice turning professional, distant. "I forgot my place." "Shania." "No, Mr. Lansbury. You're absolutely correct. I'm the help. You're the boss. I should never have allowed myself to forget that distinction." David's face crumpled for just a moment before the mask snapped back into place. It's better this way. For everyone. Of course it is. Shania moved toward the door, then paused. What about Isabella? She's finally starting to trust, to open up. Are you planning to explain to her why I'm suddenly treating her like just another job? She'll adjust. Children are resilient. The callousness of the statement made Shania's chest burn with fury. Children are resilient. That's your solution? Let her think that everyone who cares about her will eventually pull away. Better than teaching her that love is something she can count on, David shot back, his composure finally cracking. Better than setting her up for the kind of disappointment that could break her completely when reality hits. Like it broke you? The question cut through his anger like a blade, leaving raw truth exposed. David turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with the effort of staying closed off. This conversation is over. I'll arrange for your severance and references. You can stay until we find a replacement. How generous. Shania's voice dripped with bitter disappointment. And what happens when Isabella asks where I went? What lie do we tell her about why the woman who loves her suddenly disappeared? We tell her the truth, David said without turning around. That some things are too good to be real. Shania left his office feeling like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Isabella, who had clearly been listening at the door. You're leaving? It wasn't a question. Shania knelt down, her heart breaking at the resignation already forming in Isabella's young eyes. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, sweetheart. And sometimes those mistakes hurt people we care about. But you love us, Isabella said with devastating simplicity. And we love you. Why isn't that enough? Shania pulled Isabella into her arms, memorizing the feeling of the child's trust, her warmth, her acceptance. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the things that keep us apart. That's stupid, Isabella whispered fiercely. Mama said love was the strongest thing in the world. Your mama was braver than me, Shania whispered back, tears finally spilling over. Much, much braver. As she held Isabella in the hallway of the house that had briefly felt like home, Shania wondered if David was right. If some dreams were too dangerous to chase, some loves too complicated to survive in the real world. But the purple crayon in her pocket, Isabella's gift that she carried everywhere, seemed to whisper that courage and strength could coexist, even in the darkest moments. The question was whether she had enough of either to fight for what mattered most. 3 days of silence stretched through the mansion like a wound that wouldn't heal. Shania moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her warmth replaced by professional courtesy that fooled no one. Isabella had stopped talking entirely, retreating into patterns and routines that grew more rigid by the hour. Even Jamal's piano playing had turned melancholy, minor keys echoing through empty rooms. David buried himself in work, taking meetings at all hours to avoid the accusation in his daughter's eyes. But late at night, he found himself standing outside Isabella's door, listening to Shania's voice as she read bedtime stories with forced cheer, both of them pretending their hearts weren't breaking. The replacement nanny would arrive Monday. A woman with impeccable references and no messy emotions to complicate their lives. Everything would return to normal. If only normal didn't feel like suffocation. Thursday evening, David sat in his office reviewing contracts when he heard it, or rather, didn't hear it. The house had gone completely silent. No piano music, no soft conversations, no Isabella's gentle humming. The quiet felt ominous, wrong. He found them in Isabella's room. His daughter sat in the center of her bed, surrounded by her stuffed animals arranged in perfect defensive formation. Shania sat in the corner chair, her face etched with exhaustion, while Jamal curled up on the reading bench with a book he wasn't actually reading. She hasn't spoken since this morning, Shania said without looking at him. She's arranging and rearranging everything, but nothing feels right to her anymore. David's chest tightened as he watched Isabella methodically line up her crayons by color, then immediately scramble the order and start again. Her movements held a frantic quality that spoke of deep distress. The doctor said. "The doctor doesn't know her like we do," Shania interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "She's not having an episode, David. She's grieving." The use of his first name, spoken with such gentle authority, made his defenses crack slightly. "We could try the new therapist recommended by—" "Stop." Shania stood up, her composure finally breaking completely. "Just stop trying to manage this away. Your daughter is losing another person she loves, and no amount of expert intervention is going to fix the hole that creates." Isabella looked up at the sound of raised voices, her dark eyes moving between them with painful understanding. "Are you fighting because of me?" she whispered, the first words she'd spoken in hours. "No, sweetheart," Shania said immediately, kneeling beside the bed. "Adults sometimes fight about grown-up things that have nothing to do with you. But you're leaving because Daddy doesn't want you anymore." The statement hit the room like a physical blow. David saw Shania flinch, saw Jamal's young face crumple with confusion. "That's not," David began, but Isabella wasn't finished. "I'm too different," she continued with devastating logic. "I make people tired, so they go away. But I thought you wouldn't get tired of me." Shania's face went white. "Isabella, listen to me very carefully. You are not too different. You are not too much. You are perfect exactly as you are, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be in your life. Then why are you leaving?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. David watched Shania struggle for an answer that would make sense to a child, an explanation that wouldn't destroy Isabella's faith in love itself. "Because sometimes," Shania said carefully, "adults make choices based on fear instead of love. And sometimes we hurt people we care about because we're too scared to fight for what matters." Her eyes found David's as she spoke, and he saw everything she wasn't saying. The challenge, the heartbreak, the slim hope that he might prove her wrong. David spent that night walking the empty rooms of his mansion, carrying Isabella's purple crayon in his pocket like a talisman. Every corner held memories of the past month. Shania teaching Isabella to cook, all of them building the storm fort. The sound of genuine laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. At 3 a.m., he stood in his office staring at the photograph that had started their downfall. But now, instead of seeing scandal and shame, he saw truth. He saw a man who had forgotten how to be happy until a woman and her son had reminded him what family could feel like. He saw love, messy, complicated, risky love that was worth fighting for. His phone sat on the desk, Blackwood's number still in the call history. One conversation, one payment, and the story would disappear. But that would only be the beginning. There would always be another photographer, another threat, another reason why loving Shania was impossible. Unless he stopped making it impossible. David picked up his phone, but instead of calling Blackwood, he dialed his publicist. "Margaret, I need you to draft a statement, and I need it ready for release by morning." Friday morning brought chaos. David's statement had gone live at sunrise. Lansbury Technologies' CEO addresses personal life. Love doesn't recognize class boundaries. In it, he had laid out the truth, his love for Shania, her integrity and dedication, Isabella's transformation under her care. He'd addressed the power differential head-on, acknowledging the complexity, while refusing to apologize for finding happiness with someone who saw past his wealth to his heart. The phones hadn't stopped ringing. His board was scheduling an emergency meeting. Social media was divided between outrage and support. But none of that mattered when he found Shania in the kitchen, staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered without looking up. "Yes, I did." David approached slowly, afraid she might disappear like a dream if he moved too quickly. "I should have done it 3 days ago. I should have told the world that loving you is the best decision I've ever made." "David, I love you," he said simply. "Not despite who you are or where you come from, but because of who you are. Because you see beauty in my daughter's differences. Because you make our house feel like home. Because you're brave enough to love complicated people." Shania finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This could ruin everything you've built." "What I built was a monument to loneliness," David said, reaching for her hands. "I'd rather have a scandal-ridden life with you than a perfect one without you." "And Isabella?" "Isabella asked me this morning if love was strong enough to fix broken things," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's time we found out." Through the kitchen window, they could see Isabella and Jamal in the garden, the little girl finally playing again, her rigid patterns replaced by organic joy. "So what happens now?" Shania asked. David pulled the purple crayon from his pocket and placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it gently. "Now we choose brave," he said. Together. 6 months later, the garden behind the Lansbury mansion bloomed with impossible color. Purple irises standing tall beside yellow daffodils, red roses climbing trellises next to orange marigolds. Isabella had designed it herself, a living rainbow that followed no traditional landscaping rules, but created perfect harmony in its beautiful chaos. 17 steps to the fountain, then turn left at the purple flowers. Isabella instructed her audience of 24 children and their parents, all gathered for her 8th birthday party. "That's where we'll find the treasure map." David watched from the terrace, marveling at his daughter's transformation. The shy, silent child who had hidden behind rigid patterns was now leading her classmates on elaborate adventures, her differences celebrated rather than hidden. The other children had learned to speak her language, finding joy in the mathematical precision of her games. "She's remarkable," said Dr. Chen, Isabella's new therapist, one who focused on nurturing Isabella's gifts rather than correcting them. "Her progress has been extraordinary since the family dynamic stabilized." David's eyes found Shania across the garden, her nursing school graduation cap tilted at a jaunty angle as she helped Jamal set up his keyboard for the musical portion of the party. She had finished her program 3 months ago, cum laude, and now worked part-time at Children's Hospital while maintaining her role in their unconventional family. The media attention had been intense initially, headlines ranging from scandalized to supportive. But public opinion had largely shifted in their favor, especially after several interviews where Isabella's articulate enthusiasm for her extra mama had melted hearts across the nation. The Lansbury Foundation's new initiative supporting single parents pursuing education had helped reframe the narrative from scandal to inspiration. "Daddy!" Isabella appeared at his side, her face flushed with excitement. "It's time for the best part." She led him to the garden's center, where a new addition caught his eye, a small pergola draped in fairy lights, with a swing that faced the fountain. Shania sat there now, her cap replaced by a crown of flowers that Jamal and Isabella had woven together that morning. "This is our family place," Isabella announced to the gathered crowd, "where we make all our important decisions." David felt his throat tighten as he recognized the significance. This was where he had first seen Shania comfort his daughter, where his heart had begun to remember how to hope. Now it had become something sacred, their sanctuary for truth-telling and promise-making. And today, Isabella continued with the dramatic flair she'd developed since becoming more confident, We have the most important decision of all. David's breath caught as Isabella produced a small velvet box from her pocket. The ring he'd shown her just that morning, asking for her blessing before he took the most important step of his life. "Shania," Isabella said solemnly, approaching the swing with ceremonial gravity, "we have a question for you." The garden fell quiet, except for the fountain's gentle murmur. David watched Shania's eyes widen as Isabella opened the box, revealing the vintage sapphire ring surrounded by small diamonds. Elena's ring, which Isabella had insisted was perfect because it has purple in it when the light hits it right. "We know you already love us," Isabella continued, her voice carrying the wisdom that never failed to amaze David. "And we love you. But Daddy wants to make it official, so everyone in the world knows you belong with us forever." Shania's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling over as she looked from Isabella to David, who had approached and now knelt beside his daughter. "Shania Brown," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved us. Not just Isabella, not just me, but the family we didn't know we could be. You taught us that love isn't about being perfect. It's about seeing each other perfectly." He took the ring from Isabella's small hands, holding it up to catch the afternoon light. The sapphire did indeed hold hints of purple, just as his daughter had promised. "I know this is unconventional. I know we're complicated. But complicated has never scared you before." His voice broke slightly. "Will you marry us? Will you let us be your family, officially and forever?" The garden held its breath. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. Shania looked around at the faces surrounding them. Isabella's hopeful excitement, Jamal's proud grin, their friends and neighbors who had become their chosen community. Then her eyes returned to David's, seeing past the billionaire facade to the man who had learned to be vulnerable, to choose love over safety. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." The garden erupted in cheers as David slipped the ring onto her finger. Isabella threw herself into their embrace, followed quickly by Jamal, creating a tangle of arms and laughter and happy tears. "Does this mean you're going to be Isabella's real mama now?" asked Emma, one of Isabella's classmates. "I've been her real mama for months," Shania said, pressing a kiss to Isabella's forehead. "Now we just have a piece of paper to prove it." As the party resumed around them, David found himself standing with Shania in their pergola sanctuary, watching their children. Because Jamal had been his son in every way that mattered for months now, organized the other kids into some elaborate game that involved geometric shapes and musical patterns. "Are you sure about this?" Shania asked softly, her fingers tracing the ring that caught the light with every movement. "Marrying your former employee? The board members are still adjusting to dating her." David pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. "The board can adjust to calling you Mrs. Lansbury. I've been practicing saying it for weeks." "Mrs. Lansbury," Shania repeated thoughtfully. "It has a nice sound." "It has the sound of family," David corrected. "Of home. Of everything I thought I'd lost forever." As the sun began to set, painting the garden in golden light, Isabella ran to them one more time. "I have a present for you," she announced, producing her precious purple crayon, now worn to a tiny nub from months of use. "Nana Elena told me in a dream that purple means brave love. The kind that's strong enough to last forever." She pressed the crayon into Shania's free hand, completing the circle that had begun with a child's simple gift of trust. "Thank you, sweetheart," Shania whispered. "We'll keep it forever. And we'll be brave together," Isabella added with satisfaction. "Like a real family should be." As they stood together in their garden sanctuary, billionaire and nurse, autism and neurotypical, chosen family and biological bonds, David realized that love hadn't just conquered their differences. It had transformed them into something stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more whole than any of them had been alone. The purple crayon caught the last rays of sunlight, and David could have sworn he heard Elena's laughter dancing on the evening breeze, blessing the family that had grown from the seeds of unexpected grace. Some love stories began with passion. Theirs had begun with a child's whispered, "I understand," and had bloomed into something even more precious, a love that saw clearly, chose bravely, and promised to endure.